The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window as Eleanor Washington stirred her tea with a steady hand. At 78 years old, her movements were slower than they once had been, but no less precise. Every morning for the past 40 years, she had stood at this same window, watching the neighborhood wake up around her. Eleanor glanced at the clock, 6:30 a.m., right on schedule. She took a sip of her tea and walked to her front door, her slippers making soft shuffling sounds against the hardwood floor she still polished every Sunday. Outside, the cool morning air greeted her as she made her way down the short path to the American flag that stood tall in her front yard. With practiced movements, Eleanor unfurled the flag and raised it up the pole. Her neighbors had long ago set their watches by this daily ritual. Some had even come to expect the soft humming of the Star-Spangled Banner that always accompanied it. But Eleanor wasn't performing for an audience. This was simply what she did, what she had done every day since buying this house after returning from her final tour of duty. Back inside, Eleanor's gaze wandered to the wall of photographs in her living room. There she was, barely 20 years old, standing proud in her freshly pressed uniform. It was 1967, and she was among the first black women to serve in a newly integrated military unit. Her father had wept when she told him she was joining up. "They won't treat you right," he had warned. But Eleanor had always been stubborn, just like her grandmother. Her fingers traced the glass of another frame, this one showing 5 soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder in the humid Vietnam air. Eleanor stood in the center, her communications gear slung over one shoulder. They called themselves the Squad, a mix of men and women who had found themselves assigned to the same unit and against all odds became family. "We sure were something, weren't we, Harold?" she said softly, glancing at the urn on the mantelpiece. Her husband had passed 5 years ago, but Eleanor still spoke to him every day. They had met during her second tour, when Harold was assigned as a mechanic to her base. He had asked her to dance at a base party, and they had been inseparable ever since. Eleanor made her way to the bathroom, where she carefully pinned her silver hair into its usual neat bun. No matter how old she got, some habits never died. The military had taught her discipline that had served her well through 2 wars, 30 years of service, and a lifetime of facing people who thought she didn't belong. After breakfast, Eleanor pulled on her gardening gloves. Her roses needed tending, and the vegetables in her small backyard garden wouldn't water themselves. As she knelt carefully in the soil, her neighbor Mrs. Chen waved from across the fence. "Good morning, Sergeant Major," Mrs. Chen called. That's what everyone in the neighborhood called her, not Mrs. Washington, but by the rank she had earned through years of hard work and determination. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," Eleanor called back with a warm smile. "How's that grandson of yours doing at college?" This was the rhythm of Eleanor's days, tending her garden, chatting with friendly neighbors, volunteering at the Veterans Center downtown twice a week, and keeping her home in the same immaculate condition as her barracks had once been. The neighborhood kids knew her as the lady who handed out the best candy at Halloween and who never minded if a ball occasionally landed in her yard, as long as they asked politely before retrieving it. What most of them didn't know was that the kind old woman with the beautiful garden had once commanded respect from hardened soldiers in the jungles of Vietnam and the deserts of Iraq. They didn't see the medals carefully stored in a wooden box in her bedroom closet, or understand that the slight limp in her right leg came from shrapnel, not arthritis. As the day warmed up, Eleanor settled into her favorite porch chair, a glass of lemonade by her side and a book in her lap. From here, she could watch the whole street. Old habits from her military days kept her aware of her surroundings. She noticed the moving truck 3 houses down and made a mental note to bring a welcome basket to the new neighbors once they were settled in. Eleanor Washington had faced much in her lifetime: discrimination, danger, loss. But she had also known friendship deeper than most could imagine, the satisfaction of a job well done, and the peace that comes from living life on your own terms. As the afternoon sun warmed her face, she closed her eyes briefly, content in the knowledge that she had earned every bit of this quiet life, and that she still had the strength to defend it if needed. Eleanor first noticed the moving truck on a Tuesday. The Taylor family, who had lived next door for almost 15 years, had moved to Florida to be closer to their grandchildren. Eleanor had baked them a pie as a goodbye gift and helped Mrs. Taylor wrap her china in newspaper. Now, as she watched men in blue uniforms carry furniture into the house, she wondered what the new neighbors would be like. By Thursday, she had her welcome basket ready: homemade banana bread, a jar of her famous strawberry jam, and a small potted plant from her garden. Elena smoothed down her cardigan, checked her appearance in the hallway mirror, and made her way next door. She rang the doorbell and waited, the basket balanced carefully in her arms. The door swung open, and Eleanor found herself face to face with a tall man with thinning hair and hard eyes. This was Richard Henderson, though Eleanor didn't know his name yet. "Hello there," she said with a warm smile. "I'm Eleanor Washington from next door. Just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." The man looked at her, then at the basket, his expression unchanging. "Thanks," he said flatly, taking the basket without a smile. Before Eleanor could say another word, he had closed the door. Eleanor stood there for a moment, a bit taken aback. Perhaps he was just tired from moving, she thought as she walked back to her own house. People could be grumpy when they were exhausted. But as the days passed, Eleanor began to notice things. When she waved to Richard or his two grown sons, they never waved back. The younger Henderson boy, he must have been in his 20s, would stare at her house from their driveway, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his eyes narrowed and cold. 2 weeks after the Hendersons moved in, Eleanor found empty beer cans in her rose bushes. A few days later, someone had driven across the corner of her lawn, leaving muddy tire tracks. Small things, but they bothered her. Could be neighborhood kids, suggested her friend Louise over their weekly phone call. But Eleanor had lived in this neighborhood for decades. She knew all the kids, had watched most of them grow up. This felt different. The Hendersons' yard started to change. Unlike the Taylors, who had kept their property as neat as Eleanor kept hers, the new neighbors seemed to have other ideas. An old washing machine appeared in the side yard, then a broken-down car. The grass grew tall, and empty takeout containers sometimes blew across into Eleanor's yard. One evening, as Eleanor was lowering her flag at exactly 6:00 p.m., she heard loud music start up next door. The bass was so heavy it rattled her windows. She tried to ignore it, but by 11:00 p.m., she couldn't hear her TV over the noise. Elena hesitated by her phone. She didn't want to call the police over something so small. Instead, she put on her robe and walked next door. She knocked 3 times before Richard Henderson finally opened the door, a beer in his hand. "Mr. Henderson," Eleanor said politely, "I wonder if you might turn your music down a bit. It's quite late." Richard looked at her for a long moment, his eyes cold. "Don't like our music, huh?" he asked. "Maybe you should move somewhere else if you don't like the way we live." Eleanor blinked, surprised by his hostility. "I've lived here for 40 years, Mr. Henderson. I'm simply asking for a bit of courtesy." Richard leaned against his doorframe. 40 years, huh? Well, times change, lady. This ain't your neighborhood anymore." The words stung, but Eleanor kept her composure. 20 years in the military had taught her not to show when someone had landed a hit. The next morning, Eleanor found her mailbox knocked over. Coincidence, perhaps. But when her garbage cans were overturned the following week, and then her newspaper started disappearing from her porch, she began to worry. She called the local police. Officer Wilson came by, young and polite, and listened to her concerns. But his eyes told her everything. He thought she was just a nervous old lady, imagining things. "Without proof, Mrs. Washington, there's not much we can do," he explained gently. "Have you tried talking to your neighbors about your concerns?" Elena didn't mention that she had tried. She knew what the officer would see. A kind, reasonable man like Richard Henderson wouldn't possibly be deliberately harassing his elderly neighbor. People were good at wearing masks in public. That night, as Eleanor watered her front garden, she saw Richard and his sons watching her from their porch. They were talking and laughing, their eyes never leaving her. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. Eleanor went inside and locked her door. For the first time in decades, she felt unsafe in her own home. Her hand trembled slightly as she put her watering can away. Something was building, she could feel it. The same way she had felt trouble coming in the jungle all those years ago. Some instincts never died. She glanced at her phone, then at the worn leather address book beside it. Not yet, she told herself. She could handle this. She always had. The August heat pressed down on Eleanor's shoulders as she knelt in her garden. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but she didn't mind. There was something peaceful about working with the earth, feeling the soil between her fingers, even as her knees protested. Her doctor had suggested she give up gardening, but Eleanor had given up enough things to age. She wasn't about to surrender this small joy. Her roses were her pride. Red ones for Harold. He had always bought her red roses on their anniversary. Yellow ones because they brightened even the grayest day, and white ones because they reminded her of her mother's wedding dress, preserved all these years in tissue paper in the attic. Eleanor was so focused on carefully pruning a stubborn branch that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching. It wasn't until a shadow fell across her roses that she looked up, squinting against the sun. Richard Henderson stood there, flanked by his two sons. The older one, Dale was his name, Eleanor had learned, was chewing on a toothpick, rocking back and forth on his heels. The younger one, Pete, had his hands shoved deep in his pockets, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Working hard there, Grandma?" Richard asked. His tone was friendly enough, but something in his eyes made Eleanor's stomach tighten. She'd seen that look before, in another place, another time. The look of a man about to cause trouble. Eleanor rose slowly to her feet, brushing the dirt from her gardening pants. "Just tending my roses, Mr. Henderson," she said calmly. "Is there something I can help you with?" Richard stepped closer, deliberately placing his boot on one of Eleanor's gardening trowels that lay on the ground. "You know, me and the boys have been talking. This neighborhood used to be real nice, real respectable." Eleanor felt herself straighten, an old reflex from her military days. "It still is respectable, Mr. Henderson." Pete snickered. "That's not how we see it," he said, kicking at Eleanor's bucket of gardening tools. It tipped over, spilling trowels and clippers onto the grass. "See, we think some people just don't fit in anymore." Eleanor looked him straight in the eye, the way she'd stared down officers twice her size when they questioned her abilities. "I've lived in this house for 40 years, young man. I believe I fit in just fine." Dale stepped forward then, deliberately treading on a patch of Eleanor's prized yellow roses. The delicate stems snapped under his work boots. "Oops," he said with a grin that showed he meant it as anything but an accident. Eleanor felt heat rise in her chest, not fear, but anger. Those roses had taken years to cultivate. "Step back from my flowers, please," she said, her voice steady and commanding, the voice that had once directed soldiers in the field. Richard moved closer instead, so close that Eleanor could smell the cigarette smoke on his breath. "You don't get to tell us what to do, old woman. This isn't your army base. You don't belong here, and you never did." Eleanor held her ground. "This is my property, Mr. Henderson. I'm asking you politely to leave." "Or what?" Pete taunted, knocking over Eleanor's watering can. Water spilled across the walkway. "You'll call the cops again? They didn't care last time, did they?" Eleanor's mind raced. 3 men, all bigger than her, all clearly looking for trouble. But she'd faced worse odds before. "I won't ask again," she said. "Please leave my property." Richard's face darkened. "You think you're something special, don't you? With your flag and your perfect little garden. You think you're better than us." "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that everyone deserves respect. And right now, you're not showing any." "Respect?" Richard spat the word. "You want respect? Let me tell you something about respect." He kicked at Eleanor's rosebush, sending petals flying. "We respect our own kind, not people who don't know their place." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Eleanor had heard similar words before, many times in her life. They still had the power to sting, but they no longer had the power to silence her. "I know exactly what my place is," Eleanor said, standing taller despite the pain in her hip. "It's right here, in the house I bought with my husband after serving this country for 20 years. My place is wherever I choose it to be." Richard's face twisted. "Not anymore, it isn't." He stepped closer, deliberately invading her space. "We're going to make sure you understand that this neighborhood has changed. People like you aren't welcome anymore." Eleanor tried to step back, to create some distance, but Pete had moved behind her, blocking her path to the porch. She felt trapped, cornered in her own garden. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, and she meant it. She'd seen the worst that people could do to each other in war. These bullies didn't frighten her. "You should be," Dale growled. He reached out and knocked Eleanor's gardening hat from her head. "Because we're not going anywhere." Eleanor turned to walk away, to get to her house and call for help, but as she moved, she felt a hard shove against her back. She stumbled, tried to catch herself, but her bad hip gave way. She fell hard onto the concrete path, pain shooting through her side as she hit the ground. For a moment, everything went white. Then the pain came, sharp and insistent. Eleanor lay there, stunned, as laughter rang in her ears. "Not so high and mighty now, are you?" Richard's voice seemed to come from far away. "Think about that next time you feel like complaining about how we live." Through the haze of pain, Eleanor heard their footsteps retreating, heard more laughter. She lay still for a moment, catching her breath, taking inventory of her injuries the way she'd been taught in the field. Pain in her hip, bad, but probably not broken, scraped palms, bruised dignity. Slowly, carefully, Eleanor pushed herself up. Her body protested, but her will was stronger. Step by painful step, she made her way to her front door, her mind clearing with each movement. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was assault, and it was time to call in reinforcements. Eleanor shut and locked her front door, leaning against it for support. Her breath came in short gasps, more from shock than exertion. Her hip throbbed where she'd fallen, and her palms stung from scraping against the concrete. But it was the humiliation that hurt most, being knocked down in her own garden, in broad daylight, while those men laughed. She made her way slowly to the bathroom, each step sending a jolt of pain through her side. In the mirror, a face she hardly recognized stared back at her, pale, drawn, with dirt smudged across one cheek. This wasn't right. This wasn't how Eleanor Washington handled things. She'd faced down surgeons who thought women didn't belong in the army. She'd survived the jungles of Vietnam and the deserts of Iraq. She would not be terrorized in her own home. Eleanor cleaned her scrapes carefully, wincing as the antiseptic stung. She changed into fresh clothes, her movements deliberately slow and precise. Then she took 2 pain pills from the bottle in her medicine cabinet, washing them down with a glass of water. Back in the living room, Eleanor lowered herself carefully into her recliner. From here, she could see out the front window. The Henderson house looked quiet now, but she knew they were watching, probably laughing about how they'd put the old lady in her place. Her eyes drifted to the small table beside her chair where her phone sat next to a worn leather address book. She'd had that book for 40 years, transferring numbers from one to the next as pages grew too tattered to read. Most of the names in it were crossed out now, friends lost to time, to illness, to the natural cycle of life and death. Eleanor picked up the book, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. She turned to a page marked simply Squad and ran her finger down the list of names and numbers. They had made a pact, all those years ago in Vietnam, as they huddled in a bunker during a particularly heavy bombardment. "No matter what happens," James had said, his voice steady even as the earth shook around them, "we're family now." And family shows up. Over the decades, they had kept that promise. When Patricia's husband died suddenly of a heart attack, they had all flown in for the funeral. When Thomas's son was deployed to Afghanistan, they had taken turns calling and checking in. When Maria needed a kidney, Robert had been the first to get tested as a donor. Eleanor hadn't called on them in years, not since Harold's funeral. They all had their own lives, their own struggles, but she knew without a doubt that if she called, they would come. Her hand hovered over the phone. Was this really a Red Rose situation, as they called their emergencies? Would they think she was overreacting? Eleanor glanced at the bruise forming on her arm, thought of Richard Henderson's cold eyes, and made her decision. She dialed the first number on the list. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered, deep and strong despite the years. "Williams' residence." "James," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's L." A pause, then warmth flooded his tone. "Eleanor Washington. To what do I owe this pleasure? It's been too long." Eleanor took a deep breath. Red Rose situation. Henderson residence. Tomorrow at 900. Another pause, longer this time. When James spoke again, all traces of casual warmth were gone, replaced by the crisp efficiency that had made him such an effective leader in the field. Details? 3 hostiles. Escalating situation. physical confrontation today. Elena's military training kicked in, allowing her to report the facts without emotion. Injuries? Minor. Pride mostly. Law enforcement? Unresponsive to previous complaints. Understood. James's voice was all business now. Coordinates confirmed. Squad will assemble. 900 tomorrow. Hold position until then. Thank you, James, Eleanor said softly. No thanks needed, Elle. We made a promise. His voice softened slightly. You good for the night? Need me to send anyone ahead? Elena glanced at the locked door, the closed blinds, the small but serviceable pistol she kept in the drawer beside her chair, a remnant from her service days that she had never thought she'd need again. I'm secure for the night. Roger that. See you at 900. Eleanor made 4 more identical calls, receiving the same immediate response each time. No questions about whether it was serious enough to warrant their intervention, no complaints about the short notice, just immediate acceptance and action. By the time she hung up from the last call, the pain pills had kicked in, easing the throb in her hip. Eleanor felt a calmness settle over her, the same focused calm that had seen her through firefights and ambushes. She made herself a light dinner, checked all her doors and windows, and settled back in her recliner with the TV on low. Outside, darkness fell on the quiet street. In the Henderson house, lights blazed and music played, just a touch too loud. They thought they had won today. They thought they had broken her spirit. Eleanor smiled slightly as she sipped her tea. They had no idea what was coming. No idea at all about the storm they had called down upon themselves by messing with a veteran who still remembered her oath and whose squadmates remembered theirs. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Eleanor didn't dream of Richard Henderson or his sons. She dreamed instead of 5 young soldiers huddled around a radio in the Vietnam rain, sharing a package of cookies from home, promising to have each other's backs no matter what came. Some promises never expired, some bonds never broke. Tomorrow would prove that. Eleanor woke at 5 the next morning, old habits refusing to yield even to pain and anxiety. Her hip was stiff, the bruise now a deep purple spread across her skin like spilled ink. She moved slowly through her morning routine, each action deliberate and measured. Flag up at 6:00 a.m. sharp. Coffee brewing by 6:05. Toast and eggs by 6:15. As she ate breakfast at her small kitchen table, Elena glanced repeatedly at the clock. 3 more hours until her squad would arrive. She wondered if the Hendersons were watching her house, if they had noticed anything unusual in her routine. Probably not. People like that rarely paid attention to details unless those details affected them directly. At 7:30, Eleanor changed into a crisp blue blouse and her best slacks. She pinned her silver hair into its usual neat bun and, after a moment's hesitation, opened the carved wooden box on her dresser. Inside lay her service medals, rarely worn but always treasured. She selected the one that meant the most to her, the bronze star she had received for bravery under fire, and pinned it to her blouse. Today wasn't about showing off. It was about remembering who she was. At 8:45, a car pulled into her driveway. Eleanor peered through the curtains, her heart lifting at the sight of the tall, silver-haired man who emerged. James Williams still moved with the fluid grace of the soldier he had once been, his back straight despite his 80 years. He wore civilian clothes, pressed khakis and a button-down shirt, but his military bearing was unmistakable. Eleanor opened her door before he could knock, embracing her old friend tightly. "James, it's good to see you." "Wish it were under better circumstances, Elle," he replied, his deep voice familiar and comforting. His sharp eyes took in the bruise on her arm, the slight wince as she moved. He didn't comment, just nodded once, his jaw tightening. Before they could say more, a sleek blue sedan pulled up behind James's car. A petite Asian woman stepped out, her silver-streaked black hair cut in a practical bob. Patricia Chen carried herself with the quiet authority that had served her well as a military officer and later as a federal judge. She held a leather portfolio under one arm and wore an expensive-looking suit that spoke of courtrooms and power. Reporting for duty, Patricia said with a small smile, embracing Eleanor gently, "The boy's giving you trouble?" "Nothing we can't handle," Eleanor assured her. A police cruiser was next to arrive, though not from the local department. Thomas Rodriguez stepped out in full uniform, his police chief's badge gleaming in the morning sun. His once black mustache was now salt and pepper, but his eyes were as kind as Eleanor remembered. "Chief Rodriguez," Eleanor said, shaking his hand. "Sergeant Major," he replied with a small salute and a wink. "I brought some friends." He gestured to the two uniformed officers who had emerged from a second cruiser behind his. The fourth arrival was Maria Diaz, her medical bag slung over one shoulder and a digital camera hanging from her neck. As the former unit's medic and now a hospital administrator, she insisted on checking Eleanor's injuries before anything else. "I'm fine," Eleanor protested as Maria guided her to sit on the living room sofa. "Let me be the judge of that," Maria replied firmly, her practiced hands gently probing Eleanor's hip and examining the scrapes on her palms. "Nothing broken, but that's a nasty bruise. You shouldn't be walking around on it." "Try stopping her," James said with a chuckle. The last to arrive was Robert Cooper, his silver Lexus purring to a stop at the curb. The former intelligence officer stepped out, briefcase in hand, his tailored suit marking him as the successful civil rights attorney he had become. Despite the gray at his temples, he still moved with the quick energy that had earned him the nickname Jackrabbit during their service. By 9 a.m. sharp, they were all gathered in Eleanor's living room, 5 elderly veterans whose combined age topped 4 centuries, but whose eyes were sharp and whose minds were sharper. They might have looked like a group of retirees gathering for coffee to anyone passing by, but Eleanor knew better. This was a war council. So James said, naturally taking the lead as he had always done. "Tell us everything, from the beginning." Eleanor recounted the past weeks in detail, the Hendersons' arrival, the escalating harassment, the confrontation in her garden. She described Richard Henderson's cold eyes, his son's laughter as she fell. Her friends listened without interruption, their faces growing grimmer with each detail. When she finished, there was silence for a moment. Then Thomas spoke up. "The local police haven't responded to your complaints." Eleanor shook her head. "They sent a young officer. He was polite enough, but I could tell he thought I was just a nervous old lady. Patricia made a note in her portfolio. That changes today." "Let me see your injuries again," Maria said, her camera ready. "We'll need documentation." As Maria photographed the bruises, Robert paced the room, his attorney's mind already formulating strategies. Assault. Harassment. Hate crime, possibly. Destruction of property. We've got multiple angles here. "I don't want to cause a scene," Eleanor began, but James cut her off with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Elle, you didn't cause anything. They did. And now they're going to learn what happens when you mess with one of ours." Eleanor looked around at her squad, at these people who had dropped everything and driven from different cities at a moment's notice because she had called. There were no questions about whether her situation warranted their help, no suggestions that she might be overreacting. Just absolute, unwavering support. "What's the plan?" she asked, straightening her back despite the pain. James smiled, the same smile she remembered from decades ago when they were about to undertake a particularly challenging mission. "We're calling it Operation Respect," he said, "and by the time we're done, the Hendersons are going to wish they'd never set foot in this neighborhood." The others nodded, their faces set with determination. Eleanor felt something unfurl in her chest, something warm and strong and familiar. It wasn't just relief at having help. It was the feeling of standing shoulder to shoulder with people who would never let you fall. It was the certainty that came from knowing that even now, decades after they had served together, these people had her back without question or hesitation. Outside, the Henderson house was quiet, but not for long. The storm was about to break, and Eleanor Washington was no longer standing alone against it. 5 veteran soldiers gathered around Eleanor's dining room table, which had become a makeshift command center. Maps of the neighborhood lay spread out next to printouts of local ordinances and property records. Patricia's legal pad was filling up with notes, while Robert typed rapidly on his laptop. The atmosphere was focused, purposeful, the same energy Eleanor remembered from mission planning sessions decades ago. "First things first," James said, his finger tapping a spot on the property map. "According to the county assessor's records, the property line between your house and the Hendersons is 6 inches farther than their fence shows." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "How did you find that out so quickly?" A small smile played at the corners of James's mouth. I called in a favor with a buddy at the county office. Had him pull the original surveys from when these houses were built. 6 inches might not seem like much, Robert added, but it means they're encroaching on your property. That gives us legal leverage. Thomas spread out photos he'd taken of the Henderson property. 7 visible code violations that I can see from the street. Broken vehicles stored in a residential zone. Improper disposal of appliances. Blocked drainage. Not to mention the noise ordinance violations. The local police might not be interested, Maria said, but Thomas's jurisdiction includes oversight of this county. His officers can issue citations. Eleanor looked at her friends with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. They had been here less than an hour and had already uncovered more information than she'd managed in weeks. What about the assault? Eleanor asked, her hand unconsciously moving to her bruised hip. Patricia nodded gravely. That's our primary concern. Maria's photographs document your injuries clearly. Combined with a sworn statement, we have enough for assault charges. But it's my word against theirs, Eleanor pointed out. For now, Robert said with a meaningful glance at Thomas. Thomas leaned forward. Which is why my officers will be wearing body cameras when they interview the Hendersons. People like that tend to reveal their true nature when confronted by authority. James stood up and walked to the window, peering out at the Henderson house. They rely on intimidation. They picked you because they thought you were vulnerable, alone. His voice hardened. They were wrong. Patricia handed Eleanor a document. This is a restraining order application. I've already filled it out based on your account. Judge Wilson in the county court is a friend of mine. He'll expedite it. And I've prepared a civil complaint, Robert added. Harassment, infliction of emotional distress, property damage to your garden. We can file it today if you want. Eleanor felt overwhelmed. These people, her squad, had dropped everything in their lives to come to her aid. They had spent their morning using every skill, every connection, every bit of expertise they had acquired over lifetimes of service to help her. I don't want to ruin their lives, Eleanor said softly. I just want to be left in peace. Maria took her hand. Elle, people like that don't change unless they're forced to. If they treat you this way, they'll do it to someone else next. We're not here for revenge, James assured her. We're here for justice, and to send a message that our Elle isn't to be messed with. They continued planning, their strategy taking shape like a complex military operation. Thomas would approach with his officers first, documenting the Hendersons' reactions and serving them with citations for the code violations. Patricia would file the restraining order immediately after. Robert would follow with notice of the civil complaint. And James would present the property line issue, suggesting that any structures encroaching on Eleanor's property would need to be removed. What should I do? Eleanor asked, feeling strangely like a bystander in her own battle. James exchanged glances with the others. You'll be front and center, Elle, standing tall with your medals, surrounded by your squad. They need to see who they really messed with, not just a 78-year-old woman, but a decorated veteran with a lifetime of service and friends who still honor what that means. As Maria brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the conversation turned to memories. Jungle nights in Vietnam when Eleanor had manned the radio for 6 straight hours during a storm, the time Patricia had argued with a colonel twice her size and won, how Thomas had carried a wounded soldier 3 miles to safety. They laughed about the care packages from home with melted chocolate bars and soggy cookies, and how Robert could somehow always find black market coffee. Eleanor felt the years falling away as they spoke. These people knew her in a way no one else did, had seen her at her strongest and her most vulnerable. They had trusted her with their lives, and she had trusted them with hers. At 10:30, their planning complete, James stood up. Operation Respect is a go, he said formally, then broke into a grin. Just like old times, eh, squad? Eleanor looked at her friends, at Patricia's determined smile, Thomas's quiet confidence, Maria's warm concern, Robert's razor-sharp focus, and James's steady leadership. Whatever happened next, she wasn't facing it alone. Not anymore. Just like old times, she agreed, standing up straight despite her aching hip. The Hendersons have no idea what's coming, do they? Not a clue, Thomas said with a chuckle. But they're about to learn. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, shining down on Eleanor's neatly trimmed lawn, on her trampled flower beds, and on the 5 vehicles parked in her driveway. A message in themselves to anyone who cared to read it. Eleanor Washington was not alone. Eleanor Washington was not to be trifled with. The storm was gathering, and within the hour it would break.